This is Richard Wolff from Democracy at Work with another Wolff Responds, under a month before the election, counting down. Today I want to talk with you about the profit motive or the profit system. I want to make a basic point that profit is no magic guide to anything. Never was, and it isn't now. That for every example that you might find, and boy, you would find them in the textbooks because that's where they proliferate. For every example of where profit-driven behavior leads to a good outcome, I will show you where profit-driven behavior leads to an awful outcome. The profit motive is a motive with, at best, mixed results. That people should imagine that it's some magical guide to pure wonderful goodness, growth, and prosperity is simply wrong-headed. It's a confused ideological position that does not bear any scrutiny at all. Let me give you a few examples to drive the point home. I'll start with a very recent report from the Food and Drug Administration here in the United States. It was in the nature of a warning to stores, to buyers, customers, the public. It was a warning that on the market there are dozens and dozens of toxic hand sanitizers. The item in them, often mentioned, methanol, dangerous. According to the FDA, 17 Americans have died from these toxic hand sanitizers. What an awful thing to do, to produce a product so bad that it can kill you. And who did that? Private capitalist entrepreneurs. And why did they do it? They were pursuing profits. That's what capitalist entrepreneurs do. They knew there would be a demand for hand sanitizers from a public taught that there's a pandemic which you can ward off, at least partly, by washing your hands or sanitizing them with various kinds of liquids and wipes and so on. So capitalists saw an opportunity. That's what they do. And they rushed, because that's what they do. And they knew they would face competition, because when capitalists rush into a new area, that's what they expect. So the trick would be to come up with something better or cheaper or both, and to do it quickly before the competitors captured the market, getting people to recognize another brand rather than yours. So lots of capitalists rushed, falling all over themselves to get to market as quick as possible a cheap thing called a hand sanitizer, about which they would make the usual advertising, that is to say, half-honest claims. And the result is 17 dead people and large numbers of folks at risk of hurting themselves by using dangerous hand sanitizer. In other words, at a time of great anxiety about the collapsed economy, about the pandemic, we now have an additional anxiety about toxic hand sanitizers. And that's a product of the profit-driven competitive system we call capitalism. Let me give you some more examples. of how the profit motive leads to very unwanted results. Over the last dozen years by now, we have had a global scandal in the industry producing automobiles. Why? Those companies, it turned out, were subject to emissions controls for the public health, the air we breathe, to protect people with lung conditions, asthma, or just normally breathing people who could be hurt by constantly breathing the air that automobiles pollute with their exhausts. And so rules around the world to limit the pollution, to have devices installed that would filter out that pollution. Problem was that those devices, if properly installed, reduced the flexibility, the speed, the acceleration in various ways of the automobiles. The profit motive, therefore, was created, oh wow, said the executives of virtually every company. If we can somehow defeat, undo, overcome, forget to install the pollution emissions controls, we could advertise that our cars accelerate better, go faster, etc., because they are not obeying the rules. But then, of course, we wouldn't say that. They couldn't find a way around, so they figured out a way to cheat. That's right, to do something so that when you measure the pollution coming out of an exhaust pipe, you get a different result. That's what the tester would do from what you're actually spewing into the air when you drive the car. The big exposure came around VW, the German car company, but many other companies, including here in the United States, turned out to be guilty as well. What drove such behavior? And I mean the behavior of installing a defeat device, a mechanism to provide a false reading of a pollution tester so that you could continue to advertise how your car was very speedy and spiffy without letting the buyer know that it was because you were undoing pollution controls. I'm not going to go into how many people died from the air pollution that resulted, how many people were injured, how many people were sick, and so on. You can guess at it just like I can. It's the profit motive and competition that got us that awful result. For years, cigarette companies pumped out propaganda to suggest that cigarette smoking wasn't the killer, the lung disease producer that we know it was. Profits drove the behavior of those cigarette companies. The emails showed it. And you can guess at dozens more. Let me leave you with one more. Why did the United States not have the quality and the quantity of masks, gloves, ventilators, hospital beds, trained personnel necessary to protect the public health? The answer, the basic answer, it wasn't profitable. You know, and it isn't as I look at it. A company that makes masks, for example, would have had to produce millions, store them and stockpile them in warehouses around the country for an unknown number of years, monitoring them, cleaning them, replacing those that wore out, protecting them. I mean, the expenses would be staggering for a sale of the masks. You wouldn't even know when. Might take 20 years, might take 10. So it wasn't profitable. And so they didn't do it. And so we didn't have them. And so our public health suffered. Here in the United States, with our 4.5% of the world's population, we have 25% of the corona cases and deaths because we weren't prepared. And that's because it wasn't profitable for the companies who could have prepared us, but who chose not to because it wasn't profitable. Don't be fooled. The profit system, the market in which profits are what everybody fights over and for, is not some magic deliverer of goodness. It never was. It isn't now. It's a very mixed bag at best. We don't need to be guided by profit. We can use all kinds of other systems that are just as good or better. They might at least avoid the kinds of disasters that the profit system produced, and I've only given you a small set of examples. This is Richard Wolff for Democracy at Work.